What if the next PlayStation still doesn't arrive until 2028 or even 2029? And what if Nintendo, instead of cutting prices later in the generation, actually raises the price of the Switch too? These two ideas might sound counterintuitive if you're used to how console generations used to work, but according to recent industry reporting and market analysis, this could be exactly where things are heading. Today, we're talking about why Sony may be in no rush at all to move on from the PlayStation 5, and why Nintendo might be positioning the Switch 2 as a platform whose value and price goes up, not down. Let's start with PlayStation because the idea of such a long gap before the next console is a major shift from what we've been trained to expect. Traditionally, Sony operated on a relatively predictable cycle 5 to 7 years, a new system launches, and the old one slowly fades into legacy status. But recent reporting suggests Sony may be deliberately stretching the PlayStation 5 era far longer than usual, with some projections placing the PlayStation 6 as late as 2028 or even 2029. That's not a small delay, that's an intentional recalibration of what a console generation even is. When you look at how the PS5 era actually unfolded, the reasoning becomes much clearer. The console's launch window was anything but normal. Between the pandemic, chip shortages, and supply chain chaos, the PS5 spent its early years being difficult to find, difficult to afford, and for many players, effectively unavailable. For a massive portion of the audience, ownership didn't become realistic until 2022 or 2023. From Sony's perspective, that means the PS5 hasn't had a full traditional generation yet. Ending it early would mean leaving money, players, and long term engagement on the table. Sony's broader strategy also supports this slower approach. The company has leaned heavily into live service ambitions, long tail franchises, and extended support cycles. Games are no longer built to peak and disappear in 2 years. They're designed to evolve over time. Add in mid generation hardware like the PS5 Slim and PS5 Pro, and Sony has ways to refresh interest in the platform without taking on the massive risk and cost of launching an entirely new console. Developing modern hardware is incredibly expensive. Margins are tight, and the global economy remains unpredictable. Stretching the PS5 generation gives Sony stability and control. There's also the reality that generational leaps simply don't feel the way they used to. The difference between PS4 and PS5 was meaningful, but it wasn't revolutionary in the way older transitions were. Improvements now come in refinements, faster loading, higher frame rates, ray tracing, better upscaling, and more complex worlds. Sony may believe that these gains can continue to be delivered within the PS5 ecosystem, especially as developers get more comfortable with the hardware. If that's the case, waiting until the end of the decade to introduce the PS6 suddenly looks less like hesitation and more like confidence. Now let's pivot to Nintendo because this situation is almost the mirror image of Sony's and just as fascinating. The Switch 2 is on the market, and by most accounts, it represents a meaningful step forward. Better performance, more modern features, and a clearer sense that Nintendo is finally closing the technical gap that defined much of the original Switch era. But instead of the usual mid generation price cuts that we've come to expect from consoles, reports suggest Nintendo may actually be considering a price increase for the Switch 2. That idea alone would have sounded absurd a few generations ago. Console prices traditionally move in one direction down. But the Switch family has never followed traditional rules. Nintendo has seen sustained demand across multiple hardware revisions, strong software sales, well into the system's life cycle, and an audience that continues to buy in years after launch. If demand remains high and supply tight, or if production costs rise, Nintendo may feel there's little incentive to lower prices and possibly even justification to raise them. Nintendo has always approached hardware differently than its competitors. Unlike Sony and Microsoft, Nintendo avoids selling consoles at a loss whenever possible. They prefer to make money on the hardware itself, or at least ensure profitability early in the system's life. If component costs increase, currency values fluctuate, or newer revisions include improved internals, a higher price might become easier to rationalize from Nintendo's perspective. This isn't about punishing consumers, it's about protecting a business model that has served Nintendo well for decades. What makes this move risky is Nintendo's audience. The Switch brand is synonymous with accessibility, families, casual players, and younger audiences all gravitated toward the platform because it felt approachable, flexible, and relatively affordable. A price increase challenges that perception. Nintendo's task now is to convince consumers that the Switch 2 isn't just worth the current price, but worth more than it was at launch. That means continued strong first party output, visible performance benefits, and games that genuinely feel enhanced by the hardware. When you step back and look at both of these stories together, they reveal something important about where the industry is heading. Sony is extending generations while Nintendo is reinforcing value rather than racing to the bottom on price. The idea of frequent, cheap hardware upgrades is fading in its place. We're seeing longer commitments, higher expectations, and platforms designed to last much longer than they used to. For players, this means a shift in mindset. Consoles are becoming longer term investments. You may not need to upgrade as often, but when you do, you may pay more. The upside is potentially better supported platforms, more refined games, and less fragmentation. The downside is higher barriers to entry and less room for impulse purchases. Whether this balance works well depends entirely on whether companies continue to deliver experiences that justify the time and money they're asking for. Now, I want to know what you think. Would you be comfortable waiting until the end of the decade for the next PlayStation if the PS5 keeps delivering strong releases and meaningful upgrades? And how would you feel if Nintendo raised the price of the Switch 2, assuming the system and its games continue to justify that value? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. These decisions affect every gamer, whether you're buying day one or waiting years to jump in. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any future uploads. And if you want to support the channel, check out my Patreon, where the latest exclusive is a deep dive review of Resident Evil 4 and how that game completely changed the direction of the franchise. Thanks for watching, and as always, game on.